Good morning, colleagues. The quadrennial report is a summary of what we have done together to carry out the decisions of our last Congress. And I'm happy to say that our collective efforts show considerable progress on advocacy, on capacity building, on research, communications, and solidarity. As there is not yet a standardized test for international organizations, you will have to grade us based on common sense. Towards the end of the written report, we have included some of the metrics, if you will, which give you a fair overview of the scope and volume of our work. Growth and membership participation is one way of determining progress. Colleagues, let us welcome the 39 organizations from 28 countries that were admitted as members of Education International since 2011. Their membership means that we have surpassed the 32 million members mark as of the 1st of April 2015. To be exactly, 32,478,103. In Cape Town, we reaffirmed that we are the voice of the profession and should sit at all tables where the future of our sector is being discussed. And if one picture is worth 1,000 words, please have a close look at the photograph on the first page of the report that shows Susan with the heads of all UN agencies involved in global education matters. Now, I do not want to overestimate the significance of such meetings, but we do know that when you do not sit at the table, you run the risk of ending up on the menu. In Cape Town, we also recognize that the change ultimately would come through political pressure by mobilizing and organizing at national and local levels. The Unite for Quality Education campaign, launched on the 6th of October 2013, exceeded all our expectations, both in terms of your engagement and the influence on the international education agenda. 319 campaign programs and events were organized in 61 countries, involving almost half of our membership. 2 years ago, the United Nations had no intention of including education as a standalone goal in its post-2015 development agenda. But now they do. It's one of the concrete results of the campaign. But now we need to move national governments to support that goal when a final decision is taken by the UN General Assembly this September. And that decision will imply greater international education funding domestically and in terms of assistance in the coming decade. So I strongly encourage each and every one of you to take action to ensure that your governments support the inclusion of an education goal in the new UN framework. Colleagues, we have also stepped up our work in support of education support personnel. They are a fast-growing sector that is at the point of the lens in terms of outsourcing and casualization, and they play a crucial role in the delivery of quality education for the whole child, which is not sufficiently recognized. There are other achievements of direct benefit to our affiliates that we are able to report to this Congress. The establishment of national bilateral dialogues on education policies between our affiliates and education ministers of countries that are part of the Global Partnership for Education. In some cases, member unions had never met with their own education minister, and we were able to change that. The creation of an EI-OECD multilateral mechanism for consultation and dialogue on the future of the teaching profession between our member unions and education ministers in OECD member states. Another significant breakthrough was the adoption of ILO policy guidelines on qualifications, working conditions, and the professional status of early childhood education personnel. These guidelines can be used by EI affiliates for organizing and to improve the conditions for early childhood education personnel already represented. We also launched in 2013 an international protocol on the introduction and use of ICT in education for public authorities and technology corporations, which was already subscribed to by Intel, one of the largest corporations in this field. This is an important step, colleagues, in an ongoing dialogue on the best uses of ICT to support rather than undermine the profession of teaching. But despite all those achievements, there have been serious setbacks, and let me mention three. We are now discussing the development goals for the next 15 years, while the current Millennium Development Goal, universal primary education for all children by the end of 2015, has not yet been accomplished. Only 4 months away from that deadline, there are still 58 million children out of school, while over 200 million go to school but do not learn. And almost 1/3 of countries have not achieved gender parity in primary and secondary education. Second setback, across the world, we are seeing a tide of conservative policies, policies that are placing our public services under attack. And education is caught squarely in the crosshairs. Austerity measures imposed after the severe damage inflicted on the economy by financial markets are being touted as the solution to economy's fiscal problems. It is tempting to give examples of the destructive effects of education cutbacks over the past 4 years. I will give you only one. Greece, where schools have been closed, education programs have been slashed, where many of our colleagues have been laid off or have suffered very large salary cuts. A couple of months ago, a young teacher who had taken a job on one of the Greek islands told me it is not possible to get by on a teacher's salary, so they have advised me I better also learn how to fish. We have, colleagues, where possible, challenged the conditions imposed by the European Union, the European Central Bank, and the IMF. Greece requires real debt relief, and it is a shame that European governments did not put the Greek people before their short-sighted domestic politics, that they did not agree on something that will enable, not kill, economic recovery. Colleagues, we will stand with our Greek colleagues until both justice and common sense have prevailed. Third setback. Worldwide, inequity and poverty are on the rise. We are told over and over again that the miracle solution is to come from the private sector. Well, that is definitely not the case when it comes to paying their taxes. In the autumn of 2011, we completed a study on corporate taxation in the real economy, showing how global corporations avoid and evade paying taxes. Huge sums are lost to the public coffers, at least hundreds of billions of dollars. At the G20 summit in 2012 in Mexico, I confronted Christine Lagarde, managing director of the IMF, with these staggering figures and suggested that IMF should start helping governments close these fiscal loopholes and collect hidden revenues rather than pressing them to slash education budgets. She promised to look into it. They have not yet called back. Must have been too busy bullying Greece. At the same time that global capital is discredited for having given birth to a series of crises, trust in those market actors continues among many politicians of nearly all political persuasions. As much as it is difficult for a professional educator to admit, there may, in fact, be some people who are simply uneducable. And in this climate, colleagues, as our president told us yesterday, we have seen a surge of private sector initiatives to get hold of the education market. Much to our dismay, organizations such as the World Bank have claimed that low-fee, for-profit education will help poor countries achieve their EFA targets. And last year, the African Development Bank joined the call for private sector involvement in primary education. Well, we strongly disagree. And we asked them whether they were suggesting that poor parents must choose between feeding their children, giving them proper health care, or sending them to school. Listen to this. A 9-year-old girl in Ghana tells me how happy she is to go to school. Every other day, she's able to attend class. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I ask her, what are you doing on Tuesday, Thursday, and in the weekend? She points at the traffic light down the road. That's her favorite spot, she tells me. She's selling water. During the rush hour, she earns just enough to afford one day at school. This girl, colleagues, is one of the fast-growing group of children who follow pay-as-you-learn programs, the latest hoax rip-off, if you wish, in the race to achieve education for all, or more accurately, to create a new market, to create the poverty market. Let us be very clear. We reject the pay-as-you-learn concept, not only because it may force students into child labor. We have also found that businesses such as Omega and Bridge, write down those names, Omega, Bridge, they try to increase their profit margins by using teaching templates and scripts while employing unqualified personnel paid at a fraction of a teacher's salary. Suffice it to say that we need to help those teachers organize, become true professionals, and establish a dialogue with their employers. Colleagues, we are not against the market. We do not oppose businesses that build schools or produce learning materials. They have done this since the invention of the printing press in 1450. Where we draw the line is where corporations run schools like businesses on a for-profit basis, where they increase social inequity, where they set up supply chains, or where they invade teachers' professional space and dictate us what and how to teach. We know from our research that the simplistic transfer of ideas from the corporate world will not advance the quality of our school systems. The idea that you can somehow improve quality by introducing standardized testing, league tables, and performance pay, by ranking schools by measurement, it is wishful thinking. It does not work. What it will do is generate angry teachers, stressed students, frustrated principals, and lots of paperwork. And we're not alone. In 2012, the OECD issued a study concluding that competitive school markets may lead to greater segregation of students with severe effects on education outcomes. The evidence is clear. To make quality teaching and learning a reality, equity must be a priority, and creating quality and equity is the responsibility of governments. They are not and never will be the natural tendencies of markets. Chile has taught us a very important lesson. When the authorities started viewing and handling education as a market, subsidizing schools with education vouchers, it resulted in an education system with the highest segregation in the world. And I salute our Latin American region for having taken such a strong stance against the neoliberal frenzies hitting some of their countries. Colleagues, our public school systems are the most successful public enterprises ever. We must resist any attempt to weaken them. That's also why the Executive Board decided to launch, within the framework of the Unite for Quality Education campaign, a new program to counter privatization and commercialization and to challenge those public authorities that allow our sector to be invaded by profit seekers, and to also directly confront those enterprises. There is another and directly related concern mentioned by Susan also last night in her presidential speech. Some of you may remember the General Agreement on Trade and Services, GATS, that was adopted in 1994. Education International was one of the first and certainly the strongest organization mobilizing against the inclusion of education services in that trade agreement. I thought that we had defeated the beast. Well, I was wrong. It has risen from the dead, a zombie to haunt us again. But this time, it has a different name, Trade in Services Agreement, or TISA, a name that sounds like a hurricane developing somewhere in the tropics, and it may be just as destructive. Unlike GATS, however, TISA is being negotiated in secret. Only recently, we learned that 4 nations, Australia, Norway, New Zealand, and Colombia, are secretly promoting the inclusion of education services in this new treaty. We have exposed their conduct and insisted that they stop auctioning off our school systems. Clearly, when governments close deals secretly, and when there is no consultation with labor unions and civil society, these agreements, colleagues, have no democratic legitimacy whatsoever. Further and higher education is a particularly vulnerable sector, and we have built coalitions with students and civil society groups to raise awareness of the dangers of commodified research and higher education services. Within the Bologna research and higher education, within the Bologna process, we were able to get a commitment from 48 higher education ministers to improve teaching and learning environments. But we need to take a new step. With student opportunities being sold out, with faculties being closed because they have no market value, with academic freedoms being sacrificed, with precarious work skyrocketing, we need to mobilize resistance as part of our Unite for Quality Education campaign and invite the international student movement to join us. Colleagues, in a market-driven, competitive world, we are at risk of being transformed from educators into instructors working with templates and other people's scripts. Such systems of production do not require trained professionals and the investment of time and effort into understanding children, their needs, and how they learn. Yes, we risk losing what attracted us to teaching in the first place, the possibility of making a real difference in the lives of our students. But in the international community, we have been able to win the argument that teaching is a profession, an occupation of highly educated professionals, that education quality, first of all, depends on quality teaching, that governments need to invest in the initial training and professional development of educators, and that our education unions are the representative voice of the teaching profession. We have been able to win that argument. In the ILO, where we succeeded to obtain policy guidelines for our colleagues in early childhood education. In UNESCO and the United Nations, where our profession has taken a front seat in developing the post-2015 education agenda. As well as in the OECD, where our views on teachers' self-efficacy and leadership were recognized, and with whom, as I have said earlier, we were able to establish an international mechanism for dialogue on the future of our profession. We also have made great progress with the Global Partnership for Education, where we were able to influence spending of education development aid on improving quality teaching. In fact, the World Bank is the only place where we have really major difficulties getting our messages across. They still seem to place their bets on private sector initiatives, on testing children rather than training teachers, and on avoiding teachers' organizations. They show all the typical signs of a slow learner. To whom we should give some extra attention in the years to come. At the bank's meeting this fall, we will take the wind out of their sails with the release of our latest study, a critical review of their teacher policy recommendations in the past 2 decades, a study that we have given the title 20 Years of Underestimating Teachers. As I have written in the introduction to the quadrennial report, winning an argument in the international arena is one thing. Having political leaders at national, state, and local level to follow that lead is yet another. Around the world, with some notable exceptions, teachers are increasingly working on fixed-term contracts. Their workload is increasing. Their professional space and autonomy is shrinking. Their control of their working life is challenged, and their access to professional development is limited. They often earn salaries that are below the average wage, And in some countries, they are deprived of the qualifications, skills, support, and learning materials to teach well. And the current generation of teachers is aging. And alarming numbers of new teachers are leaving the profession within the first years of employment. We have surveyed teachers in 123 countries about their working conditions. 58% feel they are not at all consulted on measures taken by public authorities to reform education. And if they are, 33% say that their views are completely ignored. Colleagues, governments need to start listening to teachers. Teachers know what students need to succeed. Listening to teachers and education support personnel means listening to the classroom teacher, listening to the lecturer, listening to the librarian at their workplaces, at all levels where education policy is developed. Governments should also listen to the representatives of these colleagues, that is, the education unions. One education minister from a Latin American country, I will not say which one, explained to me not long ago that a dialogue with the union was not really necessary, as he was the whole day in direct contact with most of his teachers on Twitter. In too many countries, meaningful dialogue on our professional challenges does not exist. Sometimes because of, let us call it, a misunderstanding about our role to solely defend our members' terms and employment conditions. For example, in some national delegations to the annual OECD EI summits, governments include teachers of the year and other hand-picked colleagues, as if to say that the elected union leaders are not really representing the profession. While in other countries, governments would rather consult with self-pronounced education experts and private agencies than with the organized teaching profession. This, colleagues, raises a very fundamental challenge, not only to the profession of teaching, but also to representative organizations in general and their democratic policy-making processes. Would anybody imagine replacing elections with opinion polls? If we want education that corresponds to public needs and democratic values, the challenge is not to redefine democracy or to redefine the public good, simply to fit the demands of the market or short-term political needs, but rather to rectify and to rebuild respect for the values that have always inspired quality education and decent societies. The first step in reclaiming the profession is to assert ourselves at all tables at which professional standards are set and education policy is made. This also means that our organizations take the lead in the teachers' councils, the teachers' registers, the teachers' chambers, and whatever other names are being given to the agencies or bodies where parameters and standards are set for certifying our members. This is not to be left to public authorities. This is not to be left to employers, let alone to consultancies that pop up everywhere. The education tumbleweeds, I call them, living off an ever-growing portion of our education budget, blowing from town to town. It is our profession. The combined expertise that education unions represent is our professional capital, our professional investment, as well as the responsibility that we have towards classroom teachers and their students. Today, we are talking about global education, which is simply put, a concept of education accessible worldwide and of educational objectives and skill sets reflecting global needs. But tomorrow, colleagues, that discussion will focus on teaching standards, on teachers' competency profiles. We should not wait, but rather initiate those discussions, consult with key stakeholders, and take the lead in developing standards and profiles. We must and we will reclaim the profession internationally and provide a framework for your professional work at the national level. Colleagues, there will be no education systems without an effective teaching profession, and there will be no teaching profession without independent education unions. It's too bad. It is too bad that in too many places this irrefutable truth has not yet been recognized. In the past 4 years, we have been confronted with too many infringements of international human and trade union rights standards. I do not have to explain to you that behind the long list of countries in section 3 of this report, there is blood, there is sweat, and there are a lot of tears. But public authorities that continue to refuse to recognize our right to organize, our right to strike, I'm tempted to speak in Star Trek terms and say resistance is futile, meaning that ultimately they cannot prevent teachers' organizations to be formed and to act illegally if required. History is on our side. We are outraged at the arrest of Esmail Abdi of the Iranian Teachers Association 3 weeks ago when he tried to obtain a visa for Canada to attend our Congress. We have demanded his immediate release and the release of 4 other colleagues. And we have asked the Secretary General of the United Nations and the Directors General of ILO and UNESCO to also intervene with the Iranian authorities, and they have done so. Colleagues, we cannot accept this. We must stand up whenever a colleague is being thrown in jail for the simple reason that they are a member of a union, or that they are leading a union or taking part in union activities. We must never, ever accept that. In Bahrain, Mahdi Abu Deeb, president of the Bahrain Teachers Association, is serving a 5-year prison term for having organized a teachers' demonstration against human rights abuses, falsely construed as an attempt to overthrow the regime. With Amnesty International, the ITUC and the PSI, we have mounted a global campaign. We talk directly to the Bahraini authorities, but so far to no avail. 4 years ago, colleagues, we celebrated, you will remember that, the Arab Spring, and we recognized our affiliates for having played such an active role in promoting democracy, social justice, and quality education for all in their countries. We established a cross-regional structure. We organized conferences. We provided assistance programs and helped them withstand anti-democratic forces, whether represented by authoritarian regimes or by militant anti-secular movements that are gaining strength throughout the Middle East and North Africa. It is an uphill battle, but one that we cannot afford to lose. There is an old principle, colleagues, that we should dust off. No democracy without trade union rights, and no trade union rights without democracy. Some Western nations that claim to fully respect democracy are increasingly ignoring the fundamental international labor standards applicable to our sector. In the name of austerity, some have revoked the right to strike, have broken collective agreements, and have taken away check-off systems, not only undermining our rights, but also, in effect, legitimizing human rights violations by such countries as Cambodia, Ecuador, Fiji, Honduras, Korea, Swaziland, Turkey, Uzbekistan, to mention a few notorious offenders with whom we have crossed swords in the past 4 years. One of the most important but not always visible restrictions on bargaining is limits on the scope of bargaining. Those limits often affect professional issues. In 2013, teachers in Denmark were locked out in order to impose rules that left working time to the discretion of principals. In several states in the United States, professional and trade union issues have been pulled off the table, including a teacher evaluation, performance-based compensation and working time. In Tennessee, I've been told, collective bargaining has been replaced with collaborative conferencing, whatever that means. In Spain, teachers' representatives were sent back to school after their union leave had been unilaterally withdrawn from one day to the next. And the latest assault is the union law proposed by the British government to curtail union rights in England, Wales, and Scotland. Colleagues, the ILO will be working overtime. There is some good news as well. We can point to accomplishments in remedying discrimination. Certainly, for example, where it concerns the understanding and respect for LGBT rights by and within our member organizations, in education, in society, and even all the way to the United States Supreme Court. But in some parts of the world, there is still a long way to go. Being in Ottawa, colleagues, having received an Indigenous welcome last night, we were reminded of the long way to go before justice is done to the Indigenous peoples in this country and in many others. Throughout its history, the Education International has consistently advocated the achievement of the Indigenous Rights Conventions and the right to Indigenous education at the United Nations, at the ILO, and at UNESCO. And in the past 4 years, we have focused on Latin America, researching the availability of intercultural and multilingual education in Mexico, Guatemala, Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia, and bringing Indigenous education leaders together to develop equality strategies. Yes, we have been on the move for equality. Our founding president, Mary Futrell, told us at the second EI World Women's Conference earlier this year that we are a role model for other organizations around the world. We have a particular responsibility in achieving equality objectives, not only to ourselves, but also to our students. There is progress, but as our quadrennial survey has shown, much more is to be done. There's also our Gender Equality Action Plan, but we need to work harder to fully implement it. We have worked with UNESCO and the United Nations Girls' Education Initiative to address gender-based and other violence occurring in and around schools. Colleagues, who could have thought, where we last met in Cape Town 4 years ago, that girls' education would become the target of religious extremism, Malala being one of many victims. In Pakistan, in Afghanistan, the Taliban hunted women teachers working in girls' schools. Several were shot in the past 2 years. And at our request, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon took the Pakistan government to task. We also launched an advertising campaign in the main Pakistani newspapers, urging the people of Pakistan to stand up and support their teachers and students. It did not prevent the assault on a school in Peshawar several months ago, where 141 persons were killed, including teachers trying to save their students. In Nigeria, as we all know, Boko Haram assassinated hundreds of teachers in the past 5 years and abducted teachers' families. Over 200 girls were kidnapped in April 2014, and some still remain missing. And more abductions and killings have taken place since then. Just yesterday, 32 students in Turkey on their way to build libraries for Syrian refugees were brutally assassinated. Colleagues, we shiver, we protest, and we are appalled by the weak and ineffective responses of our public authorities. This in stark contrast to the incredible courage displayed by teachers who try to protect their students and stop heavily armed men invading their classrooms. They stood up for the rights of their students. They refused to stop teaching and close their schools, but they paid the highest price a person can pay. Let their souls be blessed. And who could have thought, when we left Cape Town 4 years ago, that schools would become a target of warfare? Let me thank you for standing with our colleagues in Palestine who suffered under missile attacks last summer, as did our colleagues in Israel and in the eastern part of the Ukraine. Let me also thank you for standing by our colleagues in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, where so many colleagues lost their lives in conflicts in which they had no part. Your generous contributions enabled us to provide solidarity support, humanitarian assistance, and hope to affiliates hit by man-made as well as natural disasters. Our solidarity and development work also entailed a tremendous volume of capacity-building programs carried out in all regions, despite limited external funds available for that work. Let me thank all affiliates listed in the back of the report that have contributed to these programs. Many focused on boosting membership participation in the Unite for Quality Education campaign, and many on empowering women and minority groups. Colleagues, mobilizing and organizing is the lifeblood of any labor union. If we look at EI itself and at the Unite campaign, membership participation is relatively high. Also, more than 1/3 of 393 member organizations, 1/3 is represented on the regional committees and the World Executive Board, and that 1/3 represents more than 60% of our total membership. The quadrennial report lists all the meetings of our governing and advisory bodies, and you may have noticed that while our international is divided into 5 regions, there are only 4 regional structures: Africa, Asia Pacific, Europe, and Latin America. Because we are increasingly calling for input from regions, we will propose after this Congress to establish a light regional structure for our affiliates in North America and the Caribbean, which will also facilitate better communication with and among them. Colleagues, when you do not take our 393 member unions as a measuring stick for membership participation, but your 32 million, the figures are not very impressive. Too many classroom teachers, too many education support personnel are not familiar with the impact of global education reform on their daily work and the important contributions they could make to our advocacy and to our online discussions and campaigns. Yes, We are, as Susan said yesterday, also an organization of organizations with a very strong belief in democratic representation. And no, we will not ever give up on that. But we are more than a league of education union leaders. Successful international advocacy increasingly depends on the ability to build and mobilize audiences online. And I'm asking you, and it's not for the first time, to give more exposure to Education International in your publications, on your websites, at your conferences. Help us reach your members. Help us organize. Help us grow digitally. To conclude, colleagues, protecting our school systems, reclaiming our profession, and strengthening our unions is the triangular task which Education International is to accomplish. Through advocacy, through research, through legal and solidarity assistance, and through capacity building and organizing. We have, in the past 4 years, made important steps forward. We can all be proud of EI and of our collective accomplishments. And if the Director General of the ILO himself tells us we are a success story, it must be true. We are confident. We believe that we can forge this organization into a very powerful instrument, a very powerful tool that will enhance our education systems, restore our profession, and build fairer and more democratic societies. We can do it. Thank you.